welcome back to another episode of the Jam Sesh podcast. And this is the third and final installment of the Kurt Cobain series and why he was so iconic and notable both during his time and even still to this day. So just to recap, I wanted to talk about him since it's been 31 years since his death and talk about what made him stand out in comparison to other celebrities and musicians. So in the first episode, I talked about his music and what he did in Nirvana and how that was different from what other rock musicians were doing at the time. And in the second part, I talked about his public persona and how he turns this idea of being a celebrity on its head, how he was a very non-traditional celebrity and public figure. Now, in this last episode, I want to talk about the more controversial and darker aspects of his persona, but still aspects of him that are widely talked about, known, discussed, contested. These are just well-known parts of his life that do contribute to why he is so memorable today, even if they're not the most positive things. So today we'll be talking about his heroin addiction, his relationship with Courtney, and his death. So this episode's going to be delving into some deeper topics such as addiction and suicide, but I do feel like it's important to address the darker sides of him in order to see him holistically and as a full, real, complex human being like any of us are. And on that topic, I did want to talk more about his heroin addiction. And again, this is not something that I want him to be remembered by, but I do feel like it's important to address just for the sake of this episode. So this is probably the most known controversy surrounding him, which I think is interesting because he wasn't the only one who was doing heroin. Lots of rock stars at the time were doing all sorts of hard drugs. That's like common knowledge. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. It's nothing new or scandalous for a rock star to be doing hard drugs. So I'm curious why it was such a big news story about him at the time. I'm guessing it's because he did end up committing suicide later on. And when someone has an early death, then I do feel like their issues with drugs are more publicized. The same way they were for like Lane Staley, for example, who died in 2002. He also struggled with drugs. And interestingly enough, both Lane and Kurt died on April 5th. April 5th, 8 years apart. Isn't that kind of weird? The two biggest grunge frontmen. But anyways, regarding his heroin addiction, it was kind of insider knowledge at first, like in hushed whispers amongst other musicians, crew members, music journalists, people who were in that scene and in that environment. It was just kind of hushed gossip that Kurt may have been using heroin. And that's normally how these things start, because people are not always publicizing this sort of stuff, but at the same time it's hard to hide it amongst the people you know personally. So the story that I know, which I read in Heavier Than Heaven, was that Kurt tried heroin once in the 80s, like in the late 80s, when he was still living in Olympia. He just tried it once randomly because someone offered it to him. Then Chris found out he did it and he was like, hey, like, you need to promise me you won't ever do this again. Like, this is not something you want to get involved with. And then Kurt was like, yeah, I won't do it. And clearly something about the heroin made Kurt feel good. The way people describe heroin, they describe it as like love. Bubbles of love are running through your veins. I'm not super up to date with the science of this, but I think heroin is meant to mess with your brain's reward systems, especially when it comes to experiencing pleasure. Like, it gives you a lot of oxytocin, and then your body gets so used to that high that you need it to feel anything. But at some point, heroin can only do so much before it kills you. And at some point, you're not even feeling pleasure from it anymore. You just need it to stop the withdrawal symptoms. And I think that's how most drug addictions tend to work. And even when Kurt would talk about his heroin, even when Kurt talked about what it was like to be on heroin, he would say that he was just happy and he would love everybody. This is also random, but I read this book called Clothes, 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 Music, 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 Boys, Boys, Boys by Vivian Albertine, who was a member of the Slits, which is a all-female punk band in the 70s in England. The Slits, by the way, were one of Kurt's influences. But she also talked about how heroin just feels like love bubbling through your veins. Like, that seems to be the common feeling, or the way that heroin is described, is that it just gives you feelings of love. It makes you feel loved, and it makes you love everyone and everything. And I find that really interesting because Kurt is someone who, his parents divorced at age 9, and then suddenly he didn't really have a home. He just shifted from house to house. He lived with his father for a while, but his father prioritized his new wife over Kurt. He lived with his mother for a while, but his mother prioritized her new husband over Kurt. Both his parents wanted to move on with their new families and leave their original kids behind. So Kurt felt unwanted by either of them. And then he was just going around from house to house, staying with random relatives, random friends, random people in his town. He would just stay with someone for 6 months to a year, then be living with someone else once he got kicked out. There was a time where he spent a night in a cardboard box on someone's porch. He even lived in a car during the making of Nevermind. So he flew down to LA to work on the album, then he flew back up home and then went to sleep in his car right after having come back from recording one of the biggest albums of all time. It seems to me, and I'm saying the word seems a lot because I want you to understand this is my analysis of the situation. I don't want to talk as if I knew him. I'm talking as someone who is a fan and has read a lot about him. That this is my analysis that I've put together. But he was someone who grew up and spent his childhood and his formative years not feeling loved or wanted by anyone. Even his parents, the two people who were supposed to love him the most, he was kind of rejected by him. He didn't have a place to belong. He didn't have that stable family life or support system. And that was a big insecurity with him. And that's why he felt like there was something wrong with him, because he lived in a community where there was not much divorce. And he felt like there was something wrong with him, that he had divorced parents, but nobody else did. It was a source of shame for him. Ironically, the heroin was also a source for shame for him, but the heroin is how he coped with those feelings. And that's also why he and Courtney wanted to have a more traditional family life of getting married and having a baby. They even said in an interview when either Courtney was pregnant with Francis or it was shortly after Francis was born. But they talk about that in an interview, saying, like, when it comes to family, we're very traditional. We want that stable family life because we didn't have that growing up. So Kurt, who didn't have that stable family life, I imagine he probably felt a lack of love in his life. And yes, he did later fall in love with Courtney, but one, their relationship was kind of tumultuous and not very stable. And two, that still doesn't make up for the lack of parental affection. I don't think anything can make up for the lack of parental affection. I think that just leaves a scar on you in a way that no amount of romantic or platonic love can make up for, in my opinion. Again, I'm not a psychologist. This is my untrained eye looking at the situation. Yeah, so he did heroin once in the 80s. I'm guessing he really liked the way it made him feel, but he didn't have any money at the time. This was around the Bleach era. I don't know if he was in the process of making Bleach or shortly after Bleach had come out, but this was the late 80s, and as you know, Nirvana didn't blow up until the 80s. And it wasn't around 1991 until Kurt started using heroin a little bit, and then by 1992 it was a full-blown addiction. Because also by then, in 1992, Nevermind had blown up. Kurt was the biggest rock star in the world. At that point, he had money to fuel his heroin addiction. At the time, he couldn't afford to take heroin, so he couldn't really become addicted. Now that he was in rock superstardom, not only did he have the money to support the heroin addiction, but he was in that world. He was spending time with a lot of other rock musicians who were also doing drugs. He was exposed to that a lot. He was around other people who were doing it too. So that also must have been a strong influence. And this is also another thing that makes him such a controversial and publicized figure, because on one hand, he created this innovative art that resonated with a whole generation, but on the other hand, he had a very messy personal life. And I think that's how it is with most of the greatest artists of all time, where what they bring to the world is revolutionary, pushes boundaries. They make a huge contribution to their industry, but in their personal lives, they're a mess. They're messy either with their health or their relationships or with their self-esteem or a combination of these things. Usually the most messed up people are the ones who make the best artists, because when you are messed up, your brain thinks in ways that the average person doesn't think. Your mind goes to places the average mind doesn't go, and you have all these experiences that most people don't have or know about. Then that causes you to be innovative. So anyways, by 1993 onwards, it was general knowledge that Kurt did heroin, mainly because of that Vanity Fair story that came out about Kurt and Courtney that I talked about earlier. At that point, because it was common knowledge that Kurt had done heroin, he couldn't deny it anymore. He couldn't lie about it in interviews. So he did talk openly about it in interviews, but the only catch was that he acted like it was an addiction he had in the past, like as if he'd something he used to do but doesn't do anymore, which is obviously not true. He did heroin up until his death, and he'd even injected heroin into himself right before pulling the trigger. He never stopped the addiction. He never quit, even though he acted like he did quit. And like I said, it's because the heroin was a huge source of shame for him. And shame comes from not wanting people to find out about something about you because you think they'll think less of you because of it. You think that they'll ostracize you for it. You think that they'll see you differently because of it. And whether or not that's true or not, whether or not people would have judged him for it, it is very common for people who struggle with drug addiction to feel shame about their addiction. Of course, not only was it common knowledge that Kurt did heroin, but it also became common knowledge that he had lied about it, because the story came out that he used heroin, but then you can see in previous interviews during those times he said he didn't, so he was even confronted about that. And the reasoning he would give behind lying about his addiction was that he said he didn't want kids to copy him and see their favorite rock star doing heroin, so they would think it's cool to do heroin too. He didn't want to be a bad influence to his younger fans, basically, is what he said. And although that might be partially true, I personally don't believe that that was his main reason. I think the main reason was he felt shame around his heroin addiction and didn't want anyone to know. And maybe wanting to not be a bad influence might be a part of it. Kurt didn't seem like the guy who was thinking about being a good influence. He was just kind of doing his punk rock thing that he was doing. To me, it just seems like a valid enough excuse to give in interviews to tell people why he lied about his heroin addiction. But that's just my opinion. And yes, I'm talking about the less savory aspects of his persona, the parts of him that were more controversial, that were a bit more problematic. But I just want to say that while all of this behavior of his was unhealthy, it was irresponsible, and it was erratic, I would say it's less a reflection of his character and more of a reflection of his self-destructive tendencies from a complicated result of his childhood trauma, family history, mental and physical health issues, and just the astronomical fame that he was not prepared for and didn't know how to handle. Yes, some of his behavior has been questionable, and I don't love or agree with everything that he said and done, but I don't think he's a bad person. I think he was a very good person who was just dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of demons, a lot of self-esteem issues, health issues, unresolved trauma, family issues, he had a lot going on. The heroin was his way of coping with the situation. And while he did go to rehab here and there, he didn't take it very seriously. He would go to rehab and then come back and continue the heroin like a week after. And then even the last time he went to rehab, right before his death, he escaped and flew back home. And he went home. He was in Seattle for a few days, and then he committed suicide. Whereas Courtney, on the other hand, Courtney gets a lot of the blame for bringing Kurt down, but from what I've read, Courtney was actually more serious about quitting her addiction, and every time she would go clean, Kurt would fall off the... Every time she and Kurt would both make an effort to get clean, Kurt would be the first one to fall off the wagon, and then Courtney would follow suit. It seemed like Kurt wasn't that serious about quitting his addiction. Courtney was the one who seemed to be taking it a bit more seriously. And Courtney eventually, in the late 90s or 2000s, I think, she did eventually quit heroin for good, which is very impressive because opiates are some of the hardest drugs and are very, very hard to quit. So say what you will about Courtney Love, but I think it's a major accomplishment to quit a heroin addiction. I wish Kurt could have also taken his rehabilitation more seriously. But honestly, it didn't seem like he wanted to quit. I think it was just his self-destructive tendencies. His self-destructive tendencies seemed to get the best of him. Now, going into the next and very last thing I want to talk about in this podcast series, and this is also my least favorite, but it's his death. So I just want to preface that I really don't like talking or even thinking about his death because one, I mean, it makes me sad. He died so young, 27. 27 is a really young age to die. And he seemed like a genuinely good guy, and of course he was very talented, and he was a disruptor. He was someone who turned the music industry onto its head and changed rock music forever. If you look at most of the rock bands of the 21st century, for a lot of them, you would probably be able to trace their influences back to Nirvana, in that they were either directly influenced by Nirvana, or they were influenced by a band who was influenced by Nirvana, or they were influenced by a band who was influenced by a band who was influenced by Nirvana. Regardless, for a lot of rock bands in the 21st century, you can trace influences back to Nirvana, and not even rock bands, even musicians of all sorts of genres look up to Kurt Cobain as an artist. I know he's really popular in the hip-hop community, and a lot of rappers are inspired by him and his songwriting style as well. I don't know, I mean, it just makes me sad. I'm a fan, so of course, it's really sad for me. And he died before I was born, and it's sad that I couldn't have seen him in action and been around while he was famous and making music. And also, suicide is especially sad because when it comes to suicide, it's not just about the death itself, but there's so much suffering that would have to happen to even push someone to that point. And it's sad to imagine him suffering so much leading up to his death that he finally decided it just wasn't worth living anymore. That's really sad. He's just had like a very difficult life. He was really talented, really smart, and he seemed like a genuinely nice guy. But the other reason why I don't like talking about his death is I just don't like that. I guess that's a big part of his identity at this point. I feel like since his death, that's become a large part of his persona as a celebrity, which is the reason why I'm addressing this in this episode. I don't like how his death has become so sensationalized, and it seems to be the main thing he has become remembered by in the past few decades since his death. Since his death 31 years ago, it seems to be the main thing that he's remembered by. Like, death and being part of the 27 Club is kind of part of his brand, which I don't love, and I think that's really sad to define someone by their death. Yes, he had a sensational death. Shooting yourself at such a young age, becoming part of the 27 Club, and then there's also all the conspiracies that surrounded afterward. His death was turned into this media circus. And when it comes to people who are not Nirvana fans, a lot of them do know him for his death more than his life. And I don't love that his death and his heroin addiction define him so much in the public eye when there's so much more to who he was as a person. And in general, there's so much more to anyone than how they die or their drug addiction. That's just something they were struggling with. I guess I just don't love that it's a big part of his image. I just want to focus on his music and his celebrity or faux celebrity persona and the way that he rebelled in so many ways and broke barriers and made the uncool cool, and those are the aspects of him I like to focus on. A big part of the reason why his death is as big a deal as it is. Yes, because it's a suicide. Yes, because he's so young. Yes, because he's joined the 27 Club. Yes, because it seemed like he was a ticking time bomb. He very clearly didn't seem well to the people who knew him in his life, and even to his fans. His behavior has often been really weird, and people were concerned about him. And when he committed suicide, a lot of people were not even surprised. It seemed like this was almost inevitable, which is really sad. But I think the biggest reason is the conspiracy surrounding his death. Specifically that Courtney Love killed him. I'm just going to put my opinion out there. I don't believe Courtney Love was responsible for Kurt Cobain's death. And honestly, I find that conspiracy kind of silly. This is kind of random, but I saw this thing on Pinterest a few weeks ago, like this post that said, people who believe Courtney killed Kurt are like flat earthers to me. And I read that and I thought that was pretty funny. I know it's controversial. People who do believe that she had something to do with his death will probably not like to hear this, but I just think it's kind of a silly conspiracy, honestly. And I feel like there's no real evidence or reasoning to believe that other than people just having a personal bias and prejudice against Courtney Love. They don't like her for whatever reason, so they're biased to think that she did it. And down the line, I was actually thinking of making an episode in regards to Courtney Love as well, like about why she is as hated of a figure as she is / was. Courtney's kind of stayed out of the public eye in the past like 10-15 years. She just makes the occasional podcast appearance, but she's not stirring up controversy the way she did in the 90s and 2000s. So even though she's been settled down recently, definitely 20-30 years ago, she was one of the most hated celebrities. And I think it would be interesting to examine that and to analyze why, and also analyze whether it was justified or not. Why is she such a target for people's vitriol? But that's another episode that I'm thinking of making soon. But yeah, I'm saying this as someone who loves true crime. I love unsolved mysteries. I love conspiracy theories. I love all these kinds of things. And I love diving deep into them and reading Reddit forums and like coming up with my own theories and then discussing it with people, and I love that. But despite that, Kurt Cobain's death is one that I really did not want to dive deep into because, like I said, it just makes me sad. It's easier for me to enjoy analyzing true crime because I've kind of detached myself from those cases. Like, okay, it's just some person. Like, yes, they were a real person and I know that intellectually, but it doesn't feel very real to me. It feels kind of like just a story, and I have to like remind myself like this was actually a real person that this happened to. And I think that's why a lot of people do enjoy true crime. I think you have to kind of detach in order to enjoy true crime. Otherwise, if you're not detached, then it's way too heavy for the average person to deal with. But when it comes to Kurt Cobain, he doesn't seem detached for me. He seems very real to me because I'm such a fan. I've read about his life. I listen to his music all the time. I play his music on the guitar. I'm a big fan, so he seems very real to me. I don't feel detached, so that's why I have a hard time reading about his death. Additionally, like I said, I don't believe the conspiracy that Courtney killed him, so I have read about it. I find it pretty silly. And that's why I'm not going to go into the details of the investigation and all that, because that's not really what this is about. Let me just say one brief thing, though, a genuine question I have. Kurt escaped from rehab. He supposedly jumped off a fence and ran away. Someone who worked there said no, he didn't jump off a fence, he just walked out the door. Regardless of how he left, he escaped rehab. He got on a plane back to Seattle from LA where his rehab was. He was seated next to Duff McKagan on the plane, who was a drummer in Guns N' Roses. He flew back home, and then he spent some days in Seattle, and then he committed suicide supposedly on April 5th, and then his body was found on April 7th. And the coroners predicted that he would have died on April 5th based on the condition of his body, and that was ruled his official death day. But what I don't get is, if Courtney did hire a hitman to kill him, how did she know he was going to escape rehab? That was not planned. He escaped, and then he was missing for a while, and she even filed a missing person report because he wasn't in rehab and nobody knew where he was for a while until they found his body. So how could she have hired someone to kill him if she didn't know he was going to escape rehab. But anyways, yeah, I love discussing these kinds of crime things with any other case, truly. But this is one that I just feel a bit closer to for some reason. I mean, not for some reason, it's because I'm a fan. Like, obviously I don't know these people personally, but when you're a fan, then they do feel close to your heart. But what I especially hate to see, and luckily I don't see this often, but a little bit here and there, I do see jokes being made about his death. I've seen memes or jokes about his suicide, like, name a more iconic duo, and then it'll be a picture of Kurt and a picture of a gun. Like, that's terrible. That's not iconic. That's tragic. That's a real person who suffered and committed suicide, and whose family suffered, and whose family and loved ones are still grieving his death to this day, and it's just like a joke to you. I understand if you're not a fan, you might feel detached, just the way sometimes I feel detached when listening to true crime episodes. But that's why I have to constantly keep reminding myself, like, this is a real person who actually died and whose loved ones suffered as a result of their death. This is not just like a fun little mystery story. This is a real tragedy that happened to a real person. And I just find these kind of jokes just not in good taste, and they're not funny either. Okay, when it comes to comedy and what you are and aren't allowed to joke about, that's a whole separate topic that honestly has nothing to do with this podcast. But I feel like joking about someone else's suicide is just not a good joke. Don't get me wrong, I like dark humor, and I do think it could be funny to joke about killing yourself if it's done well, but I don't think it's okay to joke about someone else's suicide, a real life suicide. If you're joking about a fictional suicide that happened in a TV show or something, I think that's fine too. But a real life death that happened, I just feel like that's not okay. It's not your trauma to make fun of. It's not fictional trauma that's up for grabs. It's real trauma that belongs to someone else. But that's my own personal opinion. I know everyone has different takes on the issue of comedy and what kind of jokes are and aren't in poor taste. And like I said, this is a music podcast, and so that's not what this podcast is really about. I don't love that people just blame Courtney for his death when there's no clear, hard evidence of it. If they reopen the investigation and then do convict Courtney for it, then I'll eat my words. But until then, I just feel like it's kind of ridiculous. Oh, I am saying some controversial things. But yeah, I especially think the jokes are in poor taste. And I think most people can agree joking about someone else's suicide is just not... That's so insensitive. Like, just because they're a celebrity doesn't mean they're not a person. And that's the issue with it, is that he and his death have been mythologized so much to the point where some people seem to have forgotten that he was a real human being who actually lived and suffered. Because there's so much media hype and speculation and tabloid frenzy around every aspect of his life, from late 1991 when he became really famous up until early 1994 when he died. He has been a constant present in the tabloids and media, just speculating on his life. And since his death, it's still the same, where yes, he's not constantly in the media because he's no longer alive, but there's still a lot of sensationalism about his death. And I know this is a very common thing to happen for really big celebrities who die young. And I know Kurt is not the only celebrity to kind of be defined by their death. A lot of really big celebrities who die young go through the same thing. The first example I can think of is Marilyn Monroe. Similar story. She died in her 30s from a drug overdose, supposedly a suicide, although I don't know for sure if it was an intentional or unintentional overdose, but she also did suffer during her life as well. She went through some trauma as a child, and she was in an abusive relationship. And again, she was also in the media a lot. I mean, she's one of the most popular actresses of all time, even to this day. I feel like Marilyn Monroe's death is also just as famous as her life, which is really sad because I don't believe someone's death should be given the same weight as someone's life. And maybe it's hypocritical for me to say that because I do like true crime. And that is something that I've been thinking about lately. Like, is it even ethical to engage with true crime Like, how ethical is true crime content? That's something I think about a lot. And again, not the point of this episode. The last point I wanted to mention in regards to his death, and this is really sad to say, and as terrible as it is, his death honestly seemed kind of foreshadowed all along. And it seemed kind of inevitable. I mean, Kurt said something very chilling when he was a teenager. He told one of his friends, "One day I'm going to become a world famous rock star, and then I'm going to commit suicide and go out in a burst of flames," or something along that. I'm paraphrasing, but it's kind of eerie because that is literally exactly what happened. It came true. And obviously there was no way for him to know that. There's no way anyone could have predicted the popularity of Nevermind. But also it is sad for a teenager to be planning their own suicide like this. I mean, we know he was going through trauma, family issues, mental health issues, and it's very natural for someone going through all that to feel this way. But it's always chilling when someone says something that turns out to be true like a decade later. But the people in Kurt's life who were closest to him did describe him as a ticking time bomb. They knew that his time was going to run out pretty soon. Just his condition and the way he was living his life. And I think his manager even described him, what was it, like a match that was burning brightly or something? Basically, he was burning more brightly than others because he was so out there. He was doing so much. He was doing insane stage performances. He was really not taking care of his health. He was living fast and chaotically, which is why he was burning brighter than others. But also when a match burns brighter than others, then it also runs out faster than others too. And it makes sense, I mean, especially in regards to his heroin addiction. Because not only was his addiction in really bad shape, but also it didn't seem like he was very serious about quitting. And if you are addicted to a really hard drug like that and you don't quit it, then you are going to most likely have a premature death. It would be very surprising for someone to live a long life while also being addicted to heroin or any similar drug. There were a lot of things about his life, like obviously his stomach problems, which seemed to be unresolved, and not only were causing him severe physical pain, but also a lot of mental anguish that this problem was just not going away. Then he had a tumultuous marriage, and then he still had a complicated relationship with his family, and in general, like, he didn't even eat well. There was this one time he said that, "I don't eat anything that's green." If you see him on stage, he's very self-destructive, jumping into the drums and throwing the guitar over his head, and then it would come down to hit him. There was this one performance I saw where he was just hitting his head against the amp again and again in a very self-destructive way where it just looked sad. I was seeing that and I was like, oh my god, like, is he okay? Like, he doesn't seem well. Like, you don't just voluntarily hit your head on something continuously like that unless you're going through something. It just looked like he was trying to hurt himself. And he was known to have low self-esteem, and he was known to have a lot of shame around a lot of things. He struggled with lots of insecurities, lots of demons, so his self-destructive tendencies make sense. And anyone in his mental state would probably feel self-destructive as well. He's just very complex psychologically, as most profound artists tend to be. And that leads to a whole other question, like, do people become artists because they're dealing with these personal issues and this is what they turn to? Or are people who are predisposed to struggle with their mental health also more predisposed to be creative and become artists? Is it a correlation or a causation, basically? And I don't know if psychologists can even answer this because the whole nature and nurture thing is so complicated. Like, how do you know? How do you know what specific factors contributed to a specific outcome when you can't see it and test it in a lab? Psychology is very elusive like that. Like, who knows why certain things happen? He would talk about killing himself in like almost every interview, and I understand why his suicide did not come as a surprise, especially considering he had supposedly attempted suicide like the previous month. He had that drug overdose in Rome where he almost died. Like, he died and came back to life. Like, the heart monitor stopped and then it continued again. So he survived that, and whether it was an intentional or unintentional overdose, again, there's no way for us to know. Courtney believes it was an intentional suicide attempt. Again, like I said, no one knows the answer. The only one person who knows the answer is not here to share that story. So by the time he actually committed suicide, I don't think anyone was truly, truly shocked or surprised to the point where, like, oh, this came out of nowhere. Like, sometimes when people commit suicide, their loved ones are shocked. Like, we didn't expect this to happen. It came out of nowhere. I thought he was doing fine. But with Kurt, it was the opposite. I think they knew. They knew this was coming. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. They did everything they could to try to get him in rehab and to try to get him to quit heroin, and he just wouldn't. There's a limit to how much other people can save you. There's a limit to how much other people can do. They physically forced him to go to rehab. Like, Chris drove him to the airport, and Kurt was trying to run away, and they got into a literal fist fight. Kurt and Chris, the two people, they were closest to each other. They were best friends. They were like brothers. And their very last interaction was them getting into a physical fist fight at the airport. And then Kurt ran away, and Chris came home and told his wife that he had a gut feeling that was the last time he would see Kurt Cobain alive. And he was right. Because the next time he would see Kurt Cobain, it would be at his funeral. And I don't like to categorize people into tropes because people are way more complex than that, especially Kurt Cobain, who is very complex. But at the same time, tropes and archetypes are based on reality, and they do come from general trends and patterns in human behavior. And I do feel like Kurt falls into this category of tormented artist. He was the definition of a tormented artist. Someone who's incredibly brilliant in their field, who pushes the boundaries, who comes up with something new that no one has ever done before, who creates work that resonates with generations of people, but who have a very messy personal life, who struggle with their own insecurities and demons and trauma, who are very self-destructive and self-sabotaging, and a lot of whom do have premature deaths. Marilyn Monroe is an example that I gave earlier, but someone who comes to mind for me is Vincent van Gogh. Someone who was a brilliant artist, but he cut off his own ear, and then he also shot himself. And artists do generally tend to be more emotional and more self-critical than the average person. And again, are they emotional and self-critical because they're artists, or are they like that? Or are they artists because they're emotional and self-critical? Again, that's a question for psychologists. But yeah, I am very interested in this topic of just the psychology of an artist. Someone who pushes the boundaries of what's normal and creates something entirely new that no one has ever done before. Not everyone does that, and not everyone's capable of doing that. And the people who are able to do that usually do have a different psychology from the average person. And I'm very curious what makes them different psychologically than the average person, and whether it's nature or nurture, or both even. It's probably both, but what parts specifically? How much? Is a truly revolutionary and profound artist born or made? It's kind of like that serial killer question. Is a serial killer born or made? And psychologists don't have an answer for that either, because these things are complicated. But yeah, so that was a whole retrospective about the most notable aspects about Kurt Cobain and what makes him so important, relevant, iconic, famous, popular, known for, controversial. The point of this 3-part series, which was originally supposed to be a 1-part series, but as you probably know if you're listening to this point, I have a lot to say on this topic, and I could say more. I'm trying to keep it concise here, but I just feel like Kurt Cobain is a celebrity who's not like any other. He stands out. He's different. He represent something very unique in pop culture, in music, in art, in the general cultural schema of the Western world for Gen X and beyond. If you grew up in a Western country, especially America, there's a very high chance you know of Kurt Cobain, and even if you might not know all the details, you will probably know a few of these most important defining details. Because there's lots of musicians out there. There's lots of musicians who become very famous. But I just feel like not all of them have the same lasting power as Kurt Cobain. He's different. He stands out. And the point of this series was to just examine the things that stand out about him the most. The things that get the most attention. The things people remember him by, the things that he's talked most about. What sort of space does he hold in this cultural schema? He definitely held a very distinct space in the 90s, being this grunge revolutionary, the voice of Generation X. But I still feel like he holds a very important role even to this day in the 2020s, even amongst Gen Z. Because first of all, there's still younger generations of fans. Millennials were probably really young when Nirvana was popular, but there are a lot of millennial fans who discovered Nirvana as they got older. And same for Gen Z like myself. I'm obviously too young. Like I said, he died before I was born. But thanks to the internet, we can discover things in pop culture that were before our time, and we can become fans of things in the past, which was something that couldn't happen before the internet. But now I think it's pretty cool that we can become fans of things that were before our time because of how progressive he was. A lot of his persona still resonates with Gen Z, and that rebellious, nihilistic thing that he had, I think Gen Z also embodies many of those traits. And I talked about this in my very first podcast episode, but I can still make another episode about like the parallels between Gen Z and Gen X, because I think there are quite a few, just based on like the political turmoil going on and the way that we were raised. I feel like these traits kind of skip a generation. Like millennials were like, they were the participation trophy generation. Like, you can do anything, you can be anything you want, you can achieve anything, you're special. But I think Gen Z and Gen X grew up feeling a lot more nihilistic and a lot more cynical and realistic about the world, rather than this rose-tinted glasses version. That's why I feel like Nirvana's music really has potential to resonate widely with Gen Z. And in fact, I would be curious to analyze music of Gen Z now and see if there's any parallels between millennial music and baby boomer music as well. In fact, my next series is going to be on this subject of analyzing music from every generation. So my next episode is going to be on the lost generation. Dun dun dun! So we'll be covering the jazz age and basically like the roaring 20s. So that's right, we're going a whole century back in time, and then I'll slowly work my way up to until Gen Alpha, which is going to be very interesting because Gen Alpha is still very young and they don't have their own generational identity yet. But yeah, I talked a lot, some of it on topic, most of it not. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and it is 31 years after his death, and if you're a fan like I am, just take a moment to listen to his music, watch his interviews, or read a Nirvana book, and just think about the amazing work he's done in the world of music, and how crucial it is for humanity to have artists like this, who push the boundaries of what's considered normal, and take human consciousness one step forward like that. It takes courage to put your work out there in general, but especially when it doesn't even fit the convention of what people were doing at the time. And I think that's incredibly commendable for anybody. And I have massive respect for any artist who is able to figure out a new way to do art, a new way of thinking, a new way of creating, and to just show that you don't have to do things a certain way for it to be right. You can do it literally however you want. There are no rules. And I think that's the biggest lesson to take away from his life, is that there are no rules. He created a whole new set of rules. You can do anything. Everything is made up. And don't do drugs. That's the lesson to take from his life. And like I said, I don't know him, but I feel like yes, I don't know him, but I do feel like he would agree with that. So yeah, that was the end of this 3-part series. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, share it with someone who would love to hear me ramble about this topic, or give it a rating or a review, or just message me and tell me what your favorite Nirvana song is, because I'm curious. But yeah, that was the end of the series. I'll be starting a new series after this, and that's all I have for you today. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.